In 1999, the canal was nationalized, and today it's one of the country's major sources of income. Around 40 ships navigate daily between the Atlantic and the Pacific, or vice versa. That's approximately 14,000 ships a year. Since it costs up to $250,000 for the largest ship to pass through the canal, this represents an annual income of around $1 billion. The construction of the Panama Canal was one of the most difficult engineering projects ever undertaken. Faced with the increase in maritime trade, all possible aspects were researched so as to limit the transportation time of the commercial fleets which, at the time, were using the Cape Horn route, located at the southernmost tip of South Africa. After building a road, a 75-kilometre-long railway was built from Colón on the Atlantic coast to Panama City on the Pacific between 1850 and 1855. Soon afterwards, France led the project for the canal's construction project. A French businessman, Ferdinand de Lesseps, crowned with the successful tunnelling works on the Suez Canal, Egypt, undertook all the necessary measures to become the project leader and advocated the creation of a sea-level construction rather than a lock and dam system. More than 17,000 people were required for the project, either workers hailing from the Caribbean islands or French engineers. But the fragile soil, the abundant rainfall and the tropical climate were truly a calamity for the engineers and workers. To add to their ordeal, malaria or yellow fever led to a massive number of deaths. Over 6,300 people died on the construction site, or 1/3 of the workforce. Under pressure from investors, in 1887, Ferdinand de Lesseps devised another project based on 10 dams adapted to the region's terrain. To accomplish this, he called on Gustave Eiffel, who was busy at the time building the eponymous tower in Paris. Unfortunately, the works were so delayed that they led to the company's bankruptcy in 1889, and all works undertaken ceased immediately. But one man's loss is another man's gain. On November 3rd, 1903, Panama, supported by the United States, obtained its independence from Colombia, and the French concession was purchased by the USA. The USA maintained the project's idea on many aspects, but using only 3 sets of dams instead of the 10 imagined by the French. The works were finally completed in 1914, and the canal was inaugurated during a time of global instability. On August the 15th, as Europe entered war, the ship Ancon completed the first crossing of the canal, which was considered as the 8th great wonder of the modern world. Its impact on maritime trade has been considerable, since ships no longer need to sail around South America to go from one ocean to the other. A boat navigating from New York to San Francisco via the canal covers only 9,500 kilometers instead of the 22,500 kilometers required when passing around Cape Horn. On average, a cargo needs about 9 hours to navigate the canal, which covers a distance of 77 kilometers in all. The canal, which passes through the entire country, is made up of 2 artificial lakes, many canals, and 3 dam systems, including this one in Miraflores, which opens the canal on the Pacific. It's 1.7 kilometers long, with a 16.5-meter drop at mid-tide. The dams are the most spectacular sights on the canal. 33.53 meters wide, they are separated into many sections, each holding more than 100,000 cubic meters of water. These dimensions determine the maximum ship size allowed. The ships are hauled by small locomotives called mules. They weigh 55 tons and move on rails which run alongside the dams. The canal can welcome ships of various sizes, from private yachts to great merchant ships. The ships with the largest admissible size are called Panamax. All of the canal's dams are paired with two parallel series on each of the three sites. In principle, they enable ships to move simultaneously in both directions. Between the dams, however, the narrow canals do not allow the larger ships to pass by one another. Therefore, traffic alternates. The Republic of Panama decided to launch huge works in order to open the passageway to the greatest container ships and to benefit from the ever-expanding sector of world maritime trade. Since 2016, after 9 years of gargantuan works of expansion and renovation, the Panama Canal can now welcome nearly 100% of all ships navigating on the oceans. The post-Panamax or neo-Panamax, which pass through the canal today, stretch up to 49 meters wide and 386 meters long. Thanks to these works, the country tripled its revenue. Before, the bigger ships transited through the larger Suez Canal. After the United States withdrew, doubts surfaced concerning the new owner's capacity to efficiently maintain the canal up and running. But these doubts were without foundation, since the canal's management seems to have improved under Panama's control. Indeed, the average amount of time for a ship to pass through the canal has decreased, and the number of accidents also has decreased. Since its inauguration in 1914, a little over 100 years ago, the canal, the route which unites the world, has been a huge success, with nearly 1 million transits. And today, it's still a strategic point of passage for ships, as it represents 5% of world maritime trade. The Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, located 20 kilometers west of Paris, is a former residence of the kings of France. In 1124, King Louis VI the Fat wanted to impose his authority over the region's lords and had the original fortified castle built on the same site as the current Renaissance chateau, the Laye Plateau, which was then covered with forest. 100 years later, King St. Louis expanded the chateau and had the Holy Chapel constructed. A protective wall surrounded it all. In the 16th century, with King Francis I, the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye becomes the preferred hunting residence of the kings. He entrusts the architect Pierre Chambige with the reconstruction of the chateau in the Renaissance style. Later, under Louis XIV, the court will leave Saint-Germain for good and move to Versailles, and the chateau will become the National Museum of Archaeology. All that remains of the ancient medieval castle is the chapel, which was built in 1235. The feudal castle was one of the favourite residences of King St. Louis, and he expanded it with a complex of buildings that included the chapel, which was built apart from the other structures. The tops of its windows are rectangular instead of arch-shaped. It has a single nave that measures 24 meters long and 10 meters wide. And the tall windows cut into nearly all of the walls. It was in this royal chapel that the Emperor of Constantinople presented St. Louis with the relics of Christ's crown of thorns in 1238. The beautiful rose window was a victim of the subsequent modifications to the chateau. After Francis I's marriage in the chapel, the Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye became the king and queen's favourite residence. And in 1539, he decided to rebuild the chateau on its medieval foundations. A pentagonal chateau in the purest Renaissance style. After numerous disruptions, there was a complete restoration of the chateau's interior courtyard in the 19th century, and it's now one of the most beautiful Renaissance courtyards that can be seen today. When it was finished in 1559, the chateau's surface area covered 8,000 square meters, with 55 living spaces, a ballroom, 7 chapels and a kitchen, all organized around a courtyard. In 1661, and over the following 20 years, King Louis XIV spent a large portion of his time in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. A royal hall of power and prestige for all the kings, the ballroom was decorated as it deserved. It measures over 500 square meters and is one of the most beautiful rooms in the chateau, along with the chapel. Louis XIV transformed it into a stage theatre and equipped it with state-of-the-art stage machinery. More than 140 plays of every genre were performed in this hall, which was considered the greatest in the entire kingdom. Another vestige of the Renaissance era, the ballroom's fireplace, was dedicated to the king. Louis XIV was the last king of France to live in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. He left the site for good to move into Versailles on April the 20th, 1682, before the embellishments of the chateau were even finished. After that, the chateau was abandoned for a while. Then James Stuart, the King of England, had some problems in his own country. So he came to live here in the chateau in 1689. And then the French Revolution did its work. The occupants fled and the furniture was dispersed. As time went on, the chateau then became a hospital, a cavalry school, a barracks, and finally, a prison. In the 19th century, the chateau was in a very poor state. Nobody wanted it anymore. This was the era during which Napoleon III came to power, and he was passionate about archaeology. He carried out excavations himself, particularly in Alesia, the famous battlefield where the region's ancestors, the Gauls, fought Julius Caesar's Roman legions. And he needed a building where he could store this collection. So quite naturally, he chose the historic royal chateau, which he had restored, a place where he could anchor the archaeological heritage of France inside the history of France itself. The museum was inaugurated in 1867, and today it displayed around 30,000 objects, making it one of the richest collections in Europe. Amongst its treasures is the Lady in the Hood, a fragment of an ivory statue. It's one of the oldest representations of a human face, going back to the Upper Paleolithic, or 26,000 years BC. The estate of Saint-Germain-en-Laye contains 70 hectares of preserved spaces that border a gigantic 3,500 hectare forest. André Le Nôtre designed its gardens in 1663, under the reign of Louis XIV. His use of perspective having won out over that of the architect Louis Le Vau. Here, Le Nôtre organized the chateau, flower beds, pathways, forest and valley into a complex, irregular composition. A royal residence needs provisions for the maintenance and activities of the court. Vegetable gardens and orchards provide food for the table, and the organized gardens are designed for walks and games. André Le Nôtre was not able to completely finish the garden at the time, but it served as a prototype for the great, innovative creations at Versailles. Later on in the 19th century, a beautiful English garden was created in part of the park. It was an invitation to pleasure and imagination. Today, the entire estate is classified as a remarkable garden. In Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the richness of the styles, in very identified spaces, presents an entire summary of the history of France. Because the Château de Saint-Germain, now the National Museum of Archaeology, is a true royal palace in which a number of kings were born, lived or died. Its Renaissance-style architecture is displayed remarkably in its 5 sides, a pentagon. Chichen Itza is an ancient Mayan city on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It was probably the main religious center of the region in the 10th century, and today it remains one of the most important, most visited archaeological sites in the country. The city was created by the Mayans before the Toltecs invaded from the north and restyled the site to dedicate it to Kukulkan, the serpent god. El Castillo is the symbol of the city and its largest pyramid. It's 60 meters wide at its base and reaches 24 meters high. On the 4 sides of the building, there are stairways that lead to the temple of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent. In addition to decorative motifs like serpents and tigers, it's also important to note the presence of 2 terrifying serpents' heads at the base of the steps on the northern side. The alignment in which this pyramid was built is a confirmation of a stunning mastery of astronomical expertise. Not only makes it possible to count the days of the year, but also to predict the equinoxes thanks to a delicate play of shadows. After it was abandoned during the 15th century, Chichen Itza underwent a gradual process of deterioration, but the excellent quality of the materials used guaranteed the site's sculptural and pictorial survival over the centuries. So several buildings still remain, including the Platform of Venus, which is a quadrangular structure that has 25-meter sides and stairs that terminate with large feathered serpents' heads. The building is named for its bas-reliefs, with themes related to the planet Venus, which was studied by the Mayan astronomers and was also a representation of the serpent god Kukulkan. According to the testimonies of Spanish chroniclers, platforms like this were used for religious or wartime ceremonies. Here, the platform of the eagles and the jaguars displays characteristics that are shared with previous one. But here they pay tribute to the knights of the eagles and the jaguars, the elite warriors charged with attacking rival cities. The prisoners they captured were sacrificed, which you can see in bas-reliefs that show their hearts being devoured by animal representations. The skull wall, 60 meters long and 12 meters wide, surrounds a low altar where they displayed the skulls of the defeated who were decapitated and offered as sacrifices. On the wall there are engravings of hundreds of human skulls, which must have given the city's enemies something to think about if they were going to attack. In addition, they used to glorify the warrior tradition and celebrate the cult of death. There is no indication of a heavenly paradise for the Mayans, only the notion of an afterlife that evokes what comes after death. The victims must accompany the sun on its daily course, before returning to Earth 4 years later in the form of a butterfly or a hummingbird. This belief explains why those who were sacrificed often consented to do it or even volunteered. Death was not in fact the end, but on the contrary, the beginning of a rebirth. Close to the skull wall, the Temple of the Jaguars forms a kind of podium with a double temple on top. The building gets its name from its decorative elements that depict jaguars, which represent the night and are major warrior figures for the Toltecs, and eagles, which represent the day. The lower section has bas-reliefs that recount the feats of warriors and ceremonies that feature the feathered serpent. A jaguar carved from stone served as an altar and was covered with jade. There is another temple at the other end of the Bull Court. 168 meters long and 70 meters wide, it's the largest in all of Mesoamerica. In this game, 2 teams of 7 players competed while trying to get a 3-kilogram ball through a ring using their hands, feet, or heads. Only the nobility had the right to play, and the reason for this was certainly religious. In fact, the captain of the losing team was sacrificed, their body thrown into the underworld. In the large bas-relief frescoes that surround the court, you can see one of the players decapitating a player from the opposing team. The streams of blood gushing out of the decapitated body take the shape of serpents, one of which transforms into plants covered with flowers and fruits, symbolizing the way in which life springs from death. You can see that the Toltec warriors who came from the north truly had a cult of blood. The majestic Temple of the Warriors, built on top of a smaller, previous temple, stands above a large stepped pyramid that is 40 meters wide at the base and 12 meters high. The entrance of the temple, whose roof has now disappeared, is defined by 2 pillars in the shape of feathered serpents with their tails raised and their mouths open. Between these 2 pillars, there is a reclining sculpture of Jacques with a vessel in his hands. It was certainly an altar for presenting offerings to the gods. Decorated with eagles and jaguars devouring human hearts, the temple must have been used for human sacrifices. On each side of the temple, there is a series of richly decorated columns that have known no equal in the Mayan world. Most of the columns were probably covered and used as a marketplace. A large number of them have bas-reliefs of warriors in ceremonial dress and prisoners in submissive poses. Others were probably covered with stucco and painted in different colors. Another building that is unique in the Mayan Toltec world is the observatory, called El Caracol, or the Snail. It gets its name from the spiral staircase that is inside its tower. On the top, a circular room is pierced with holes that are placed according to certain astronomical axes. The main window of El Caracol is located at the exact point where the sun sets on August the 13th, the anniversary of the founding of the Fourth World in 3114 BC. La Casa de las Monjas, or House of the Monks, built between the 7th and 8th centuries, has a typical Mayan architecture, with decorations based on symmetry created using stone mosaic. Masks of Jacques, the god of the rain, decorate its facade. The site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988 and is considered one of the 7 new wonders of the world.
In Latin America, Santiago is the capital of Chile and its most populated city. Including its suburbs, it has over 7 million inhabitants, which represents 1/3 of the country's population. Located in the Central Valley, the city was founded in 1541 by the conquistador Pedro de Valdivia, a lieutenant of Pizarro, the conqueror of the Incas. But while the consistent economic growth of Santiago over several decades has transformed the city into a modern metropolis, there nevertheless remain some historic buildings from the Spanish colonial period, especially on the central square. Well-positioned, the Cathedral of the Assumption was built between 1748 and 1800 in the Baroque style. There is also the Palace of the Royal Court of Justice. Built in 1804, it was the seat of the first Chilean government after independence in 1817. On the square, there's a modern statue dedicated to the indigenous peoples of Latin America. And of course, a large bronze statue of the conquistador Pedro de Valdivia, the builder of the city. Santiago is the cultural, political, and financial center of Chile, a center for the regional headquarters of multinational enterprises and executive power. The Palacio de la Moneda is the seat of the President of the Republic. It was in this neoclassical building that President Allende committed suicide after the dictator Pinochet's coup d'etat in 1973. Not far away, the Red House is a majestic manor that remains from the colonial period. Now a museum of the city, its two-level brick construction was very innovative for the time and resisted several earthquakes that profoundly changed the architectural face of Santiago. In the middle of a lovely tropical garden, there's another beautiful neoclassical building in the French style. It is the former National Congress of Chile, built in the middle of the 19th century. The parliament having moved to Valparaiso, the building is now a library reserved for the country's elected officials. The coat of arms of the country is still on its pediment. Valparaiso, also called Valpo by its residents, is the second largest city in Chile after Santiago. A port overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Valparaiso played a very important geopolitical role in the second half of the 19th century. It was when the city served as a port of call for ships traveling between the Atlantic and Pacific before the opening of the Panama Canal. Today, the city is still a magnet for European immigrants, who also call it the Little San Francisco. Its urban configuration is determined by the topography of the bay, dominated by 44 hills, forming a natural amphitheater overlooking the lower city and its port, and the Pacific Ocean. It's in these hills, called cerros, that the majority of the population lives, 94% of the 300,000 people of Valparaiso. The occupation of Valparaiso's hills took place when the waterfront space was saturated. So the cerros located in the second or third line were only inhabited starting in the beginning of the 19th century. At the time, the immigrants who moved to these sites were mostly British, French, and German, so they brought different shapes and colors to their new environment. Their architectural constructions are also adapted to the topography of the area, with narrow winding streets, stairs, and even funiculars that connect them to the lower city. Each of the hills of Valparaiso thus have different urban and social characteristics. Some are working class or aristocratic, and others are artistic. On Cerro Bella Vista, there's the home of the famous poet Pablo Neruda. La Sebastiana. On Cerro Alegre, you feel the aristocratic past with its superb houses that have several stories and refined decorations, and mix the older houses that are simpler and colorful. This desire for colors was also due to the government of 1920, who wanted to fight against the moroseness of the era's major economic depression. There's only one step from this exuberance for colors to street art. Cerro Bella Vista was thus chosen to create the open-air museum of Valparaiso, which has 20 renowned murals, as well as mosaics, graffiti, and design boutiques. The walls, stairs, and even the street lights were invaded with works of all kinds. While street art appeared in Valparaiso with the idea of political engagement, a carrier of messages against the ruling dictatorship, these days it is more often only aesthetic. It is a true artistic expression. The largest frescoes are often the work of several graffiti artists together. One paints the face, another the body, the third continues with an abstract cubist or futurist decoration. Together, it makes for quite a stunning mixture of styles. While they know how to paint large surfaces, the artists can also paint small ones. Many tourists like to have their portraits made in this city with unforgettable scenery. Valparaiso, Paradise Valley in Spanish, is a city that really develops the imagination, exuding a certain romantic image of adventures, distant horizons, buccaneers, and exiles of all kind, looking for redemption or for another truth.
In Burgos in Spain, the Cathedral of St. Mary is a remarkable Gothic building that successfully adapted the styles from France and Germany with the Spanish decorative style. Begun in 1221, its construction would take more than 3 centuries. It's the 3rd largest cathedral in Spain, at 84 meters long and 60 meters wide. It's listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its main facade displays remarkable detail with the frieze of kings that is inserted into a sumptuous flowery decoration, and with its 2 spires that are a masterpiece by Juan de Colonia. The voussoirs of the door illustrate the heavenly court, and the tympanum, built before 1240, is very finely made. You can make out the attitudes of the 4 evangelists who listen to the Christ in majesty. On the inside, at the end of the nave between the rose window and the vault, there is the Papamuskas clock, which marks the passage of time by opening its mouth every hour. The altarpiece of the master altar is a Renaissance work from the 16th century, made in high relief. The Virgin Mary reigns supreme here. The cathedral is dedicated to her. At the crossing of the transepts, the splendid starry lantern rises 54 meters above the floor. Directly below, there are the funeral slabs of El Cid and Jimena. El Cid, whose real name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, was a Christian mercenary knight and hero of the Reconquest. Facing the altar, the choir contains an imposing collection of 103 stalls made of walnut, carved between 1507 and 1512. In the center, there is the recumbent statue of the founding Bishop Maurizio, made of wood covered with enameled copper plate from the 13th century. Beneath the organ, the stalls are decorated with scenes from the Old and New Testaments on the upper parts of the backrests. And on the lower parts, mythological and burlesque subjects are dominant. The many works of art that are found inside the cathedral make it a grandiose museum of painting and European Gothic sculpture. Each of the side chapels is thus a veritable museum of Gothic and Plateresque art. The Chapel of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary is an architectural jewel with Renaissance sculptures. The altarpiece, made of magnificent polychrome walnut, is in the Mannerist style, and it also retraces the life of Mary. The chapel of the Presentation is occupied by the white alabaster sepulchre of Bishop Laye, created by a French artist who came to work here in the 16th century. On the wall there is a large tapestry with the struggle between good and evil. All around there are several tombs that contain the family members of the founder of the chapel. But the pictorial jewel of this chapel is this Sagrada Familia, the Holy Family, which is a work by Sebastiano Luciani known as Il Piombo, a painter who was in the service of the Pope at the same time as Michelangelo and Raphael. Here as well, the beautiful star-shaped vault with a rose in the center gives a great lightness to the space. There are also numerous relics. Here, an altarpiece integrates reliquaries from the 11th century in a Rococo-style Baroque decoration that is entirely golden. In the apse, the chapel of Constable Fernandez de Velasco displays all the pomp connected to this post. The constable was the head of the army, and he ruled while the king was away. This is also a work by Simon de Colonia, as well as the great sculptors who were in Burgos in the early Renaissance, who collaborated on the exuberant decoration of the walls and the altarpiece. The constable and his wife lie in their mausoleum made of Carrara marble, beneath a lantern crowned with an elegant starry cupola. The title held by the constable authorized him to use the coat of arms and the blazon of the king to represent himself. The Chapel of St. Anne contains a large Gothic altarpiece that retraces the life of the Virgin's mother. Blossoming in the center, there is the tree of Jesse, which is the genealogical tree of Christ. In the heart of the tree, there are Anne and Joachim, the parents of Mary. Lying down, Jesse, the father of King David, is the ancestor at the root of the line that ends where the Virgin and child are enthroned. The striking thing when you arrive in Toulouse for the first time is the particular colour of its buildings. No other city this size in France can boast of having so many buildings with facades whose colours range from light pink to strong orange. It's a long story that goes back to when the Romans came here, because this is where Roman brick was invented. And over the centuries, Toulouse was built up using this technique that harmonises the city so well. Right in the centre of the city, the only decoration that Capitol Square has is an Occitan cross drawn on the ground. Covering 12,000 square metres, it faces the Capitol. Today, the Capitol contains the City Hall and the theatre. It was built by the Capitouls in 1190 as a place to establish the seat of their municipal power. But the palace that we know today was only built in the 17th century. It's the emblem of the city that has been the site of municipal power for over 8 centuries. The Capitouls were bourgeois civilians who were named by the count or by the king and had the powers of policing and justice and the power to levy taxes and to declare war. They represented the population and were made noble. They needed to display the power that they exercised, which is the reason for the majesty of this municipal building that is unique in France. The facade of the Capitolium was originally covered with a white treatment, which is something incredible for such a pink city. It's a classical style facade where the brick and stone alternate horizontally on the lower portions and vertically on the upper portions. Behind the Capitol, amongst the remaining ancient structures that were built around the square, there is the Tower of the Archives. It's a dungeon that dates from the 16th century. The architecture is medieval, with Gothic and Renaissance influences. It was built in order to protect the archives and gunpowder in case the Spanish invaded the Languedoc. Restored by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century, it was given a Flemish belfry with a pinnacle, which is something that is uncommon in a city that's full of bricks and tiles. The rear facade of the Capitol is every bit as good as its very formal front facade. It's the administrative entrance of the City Hall. Through it, you reach the interior courtyard of the building, called the Henry IV Courtyard, with its galleries that were built at the beginning of the 17th century. Its name is a reminder that King Henry IV had helped the people of Toulouse to finance the City Hall. In addition, this is where the governor of the Languedoc, the Duke of Montmorency, was beheaded in 1632 after he tried to rouse the region against the despotism of Louis XIII's Prime Minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Inside, a beautiful ceremonial stairway with a marble banister leads to the staterooms on the upper level. A gigantic fresco depicts the presentation of a trophy awarded to the authors of the best poems in French and Occitan. In it, you see a jury composed of 7 troubadours honouring Arnaud Vidal de Castelnaudary, the first laureate of the prize in 1324. Of the poets who have won over the course of time, Fabre d'Églantine is certainly the most famous. The stairway also leads to the main room, the Hall of the Illustrious, which is situated along the facade of the Capitol. It measures 60 metres long and 9 metres wide. The name the Hall of the Illustrious comes from the many busts of the famous people of Toulouse that decorate it. There are generals, builders, and architects. Thus, this hall is dedicated to the glory of Toulouse. In addition, all of its decorations are made by artists from Toulouse, including Benjamin Constant, who depicts Pope Urban II's arrival in Toulouse in 1096. He came to ask Count Raymond IV to go to the Holy Land for the First Crusade. Aside from the ones by Benjamin Constant, the hall is also decorated with works by Paul-Jean Gervais, Paul Pujol, Henri Martin, and Jean-Paul Laurence. He is the one who created this fresco entitled The Defense of Toulouse against Simon de Montfort, which retraces the historic episode of the war against the Catars. The current City Council chamber is decorated with paintings by Paul-Jean Gervais, like this evocation of the autumn wind. Gervais is a history painter who is widely renowned. He made many great mural compositions for certain ministers in Paris. Another painter reports on another historic event. It's King Louis XI's arrival in Toulouse. After the gigantic fire that ravaged the city in 1463, the king came to announce to the people of Toulouse that they would be exempt from their taxes for 100 years so that they could rebuild their city. Always using his pointillist technique, he depicts the activity on the bank of the river like a news report. The painter, walking arm in arm with his wife, crosses Jean Jaurès, who was a member of the city council, but above all was a very important deputy of the Tarn and a great advocate of workers' rights. With his frescoes that have the Garonne as their theme, the painter shows the vital, nourishing link that exists between the river and the city of Toulouse. Another room displays other frescoes by the painter Paul-Jean Gervais, which are allegories for love. 3 paintings depict love at 20 years old, 40 years old, and 60 years old. This room was used for marriages. One interesting thing to notice is that in these paintings, only the men age. Paul Gervais depicts women who are forever young. Another painting depicts ideal love with languid couples. Talented painter, Gervais excelled at depicting female nudes. The capital square was not always so large and so empty. The present square was only completely cleared in 1792, and its style was only fully affirmed in the 19th century, when the lime-coated facades were scratched off in favour of the brick, a style that was gradually spreading throughout the city. With the Capitol proudly displaying its facade at the head, like the standard bearer of a great city and a great region.
Siena is an Italian city in Tuscany that has 55,000 inhabitants today. The city is famous for its artistic and architectural richness and is listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Siena's main square, shaped like a seashell, is one of the most harmonious in the world. It was built in 1293, at a time when the city was powerful and independent. At the top of the square, there's a marble fountain called Fonte Gaia, sculpted by Jacopo della Quercia between 1409 and 1419. The original decorative panels by Jacopo della Quercia were removed in 1869 to protect them from the wear of time and were moved to a museum in the city. They were replaced by beautiful copies made by Tito Sarocchi. The decorative panels depicting the creation of Adam. With a curved and inclined form, the ground of the square is paved with bricks put together in a chevron pattern. The buildings that surround the square are cafes, restaurants, and beautifully made medieval palaces. Amongst them, the Palazzo San Sidoni, whose facade weds the curvature of the square. This palace has beautiful trifour windows with 3 bays and small columns. This private palace from the end of the 13th century is the result of bringing together 5 distinct buildings and is topped by battlements and a tower that was shortened in the Middle Ages, so that it wouldn't cast a shadow on that of the public palace that faces it on the other side of the square. The Torre del Mangia, built in 1342, measures 102 meters. It is the second highest in Italy, and you have to go up 400 steps to reach its summit. Its construction took 10 years, and it is entirely made of brick with 3.5 meter thick walls. It stands above the Palazzo Pubblico, or City Hall, which is the city of Siena's emblematic civil building. Its construction began at the end of the 13th century, and it has architectural elements that characterize the Sienese Gothic. It was built for the government of the city, who previously met in a church. Today, it still serves as the City Hall and houses a museum that tells the story of the city and the region. Among the works present, the famous fresco by Simone Martini dating from 1328. It depicts the captain of the Sienese army, Guido Riccio da Fogliano, preparing to seize the city of Montemassi, which had rebelled against Siena. Another fresco, painted in 1482, relates to the slaughter of the innocents.
In this local government building, a magnificent series of frescoes presents the effects of good and bad government. They were painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the early 14th century. The fresco of good government illustrates a magnificent city under the typical characteristics of Sienese style, with happy workers. It is a true chronicle of daily life that stands in complete harmony, in the city as in the country. The back facade of the Palazzo Pubblico displays a beautiful loggia that gives insight into the Italian lifestyle of the time.
The loggia provides a view overlooking the market square. This square is much older than the famous central square. Indeed, the market had already been active for a long time when the main square was still only an empty space used to drain rainwater from the upper city. Piazza Tomolè is a famous square in the historic center of Siena, in the middle of which there stands an antique-inspired column. At its summit, the Lupa Senese is the symbol of the city of Siena. This mythological representation commemorates the founding of the city of Siena by the sons of Remus, who fled Rome after the assassination of their father by their uncle Romulus. One of Remus's two sons was named Senius, which is where the name of the city of Siena comes from. The Loggia delle Mercanzie is the loggia of the city of Siena's merchants. Its lower part was built in the 15th century and the upper part in the 17th. It dates from the transition between Gothic art and the Renaissance. On the pillars, there are statues of the patron saints of the city. Sant'Anzano and San Vittore were made by Antonio Federighi. San Vittore was a renowned warrior who wanted to evangelize the Roman troops. He was decapitated in the year 290. Sant'Anzano was born in 284 and died at the age of 20. Legend has it that this precursor to Christianity in Italy was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil, but with a sign of the cross, he extinguished the fire and cooled the cauldron. The sculpted ornamentation of the building is very significant to the Sienese Renaissance. On the left pillar is the third patron of the city, San Savino.